My mother's name was Ruth Elaine Whitfield, and she spent the last 11 years of her life in a house that was falling apart around her. I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean the gutters were pulling away from the fascia. The back porch had a soft spot in the floor that she'd covered with a throw rug and just stopped walking on, and the furnace made a sound every November that I kept promising to have someone look at. She never complained. That was Ruth. She'd grown up in a family where complaining was considered the same thing as giving up, and she carried that all the way to the end. I'm 64 years old. I live in Macon, Georgia, where I was born and where I fully expect to die, though hopefully not for some time yet. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county, retired about 3 years ago, and I've been keeping myself busy ever since with the garden, a few woodworking projects in the garage, and more fishing than any man has a right to do in one lifetime. My name is Donald, and what I'm about to tell you is something I've only shared with two people in the world before today. My son's name is Marcus. He's 37, works in logistics, and he is, without question, the best thing I ever had a hand in building. His mother, my wife Carol, passed away from cancer when Marcus was 19. That was 15 years ago now. I won't pretend it didn't reshape everything. Grief changes the architecture of a family when it hits that young. Marcus and I leaned on each other in ways that grown men and their fathers don't always allow themselves to do, and we came out closer for it. I am genuinely proud of who he became. He met Vanessa 4 years ago at a work conference in Atlanta. She was sharp, organized, well dressed in that way that signals someone who has planned every detail of the morning before the sun comes up. She was charming in a way that felt deliberate, if that makes sense. Like she had studied charm and passed the exam. I told myself that was just nerves around a new partner's father. I told myself a lot of things in those first few months. They got engaged after about a year and a half. Marcus called me on a Sunday evening to tell me, and I could hear how happy he was. And I was happy for him. I really was. A man who's watched his son navigate grief and loneliness and the particular quiet of a house without his mother deserves to feel that kind of joy without his father casting a shadow over it. So I said what a father should say. I told him I couldn't wait to meet her properly, and I meant it. The first time I had them both over for dinner was the following February. I made a pot roast, which is the only thing I can reliably cook without Carol's handwritten recipe cards, and I set the table the way she used to set it for company. Vanessa arrived in a white blouse and a blazer, which struck me as a strange choice for a pot roast dinner at a 61-year-old widower's house in Macon, but I didn't say anything. She complimented the garden. She asked thoughtful questions about my engineering career. She helped me clear the plates without being asked. At some point after dinner, when Marcus had stepped outside to take a phone call from work, Vanessa and I were alone at the table with our coffee, and she asked me, in a tone that was so casual it almost slid past me, whether I'd ever thought about downsizing, whether the house felt like too much to manage alone, whether I had a financial planner who helped me think about long-term planning now that I was retired. I answered all three questions pleasantly, and I watched her face while I did it. She was listening, but not the way you listen when you're interested in someone. She was listening the way you listen when you're waiting to hear a specific number. Now, I need to back up, because without the next part, none of what comes after makes the right kind of sense. My mother Ruth died 8 months before that dinner. She passed in June, quietly, in her sleep. In that same falling apart house she'd refused to leave since 1974. She was 81 years old, and she died the way she'd lived, without making a fuss. What I did not know, and what no one in the family knew, was that my mother had spent 50 years making extremely quiet, extremely disciplined financial decisions. She had never bought a new car. She had never taken a vacation that required a plane ticket. She had kept a vegetable garden not as a hobby but as an actual food source. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a lumber company from 1969 to 1996, and she had invested a portion of every paycheck, without exception, into instruments that her company's benefits manager had recommended back in 1971 and that she had simply never sold. When the estate attorney called me and my sister Brenda in for the reading, I thought we were there to divide up the furniture and deal with the property taxes on a house that needed about $40,000 in repairs. Instead, we sat in that man's office for 2 hours, while he explained that our mother had left a total estate value of approximately $2.3 million. The house, which sat on an acre and a half just outside of town, had been appraised at $640,000. The rest was in accounts we hadn't known existed. Brenda and I sat in the car afterward for a long time without speaking. Then she started crying. and I started crying. And neither of us was entirely sure what we were crying about. Partly grief, partly awe, partly the very specific guilt of realizing your mother had lived smaller than she had to, maybe partly for your sake, and you had never understood the scale of what she was carrying. The will was clear, equal split, 1.15 million each, plus a decision to make about the house. I want to say something here to anyone who's listening, who has children, or who is a child yourself. I did not hide this from Marcus out of distrust. Not at first. I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where I was some all-knowing patriarch who saw the villain coming from a mile away. I was a man who had just lost his mother and was still processing a number that didn't feel real, and I made a quiet, private decision to take some time before telling anyone. That is where this started. I will also tell you this. I had a specific reason to be cautious that went beyond just needing time. 3 weeks after Ruth's estate was filed with the probate court, which is public record, something I did not fully understand the implications of at the time, Vanessa sent me an email. It was friendly. It was warm. It asked how I was holding up after losing my mother, whether I was eating well, whether Marcus and I had talked recently about how I was doing. And at the very bottom, as a kind of afterthought, she mentioned that her cousin was a financial advisor, and that if I was navigating any estate questions or thinking about what to do with new assets, she'd be happy to put us in touch. I read that email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to myself and let it sit. Marcus called me 2 days later. He asked if I'd seen Vanessa's email. I told him I had. He said she was just trying to be helpful, that her cousin really was a good financial guy, and that there was no pressure. His voice was careful in a way that told me Vanessa had primed the conversation before he called. Marcus was not trying to get my money. I want to be clear about that. But he was being managed by someone who was, and he didn't see it yet because he was in love and she was good at what she did. I told Marcus I appreciated it and that I'd think about it. And then, the following Monday, I drove to a law office in Atlanta, not in Macon, specifically, and I sat down with an estate attorney named Gerald Patterson, and I told him everything. He listened without expression, in the way that good attorneys do. And when I finished, he said, "You have a few options. Let me explain them." What Gerald helped me do over the next 6 weeks was restructure. I won't get into the legal details because this isn't that kind of story, but the short version is that I placed the majority of my inheritance into a trust, with terms that protected it from being accessed or influenced by any party outside of designated beneficiaries. And I did it quietly, before I'd told a single person outside of Gerald and his assistant what I was doing. I kept enough liquid to cover what I needed day to day. The rest was handled. In the meantime, life continued. Vanessa and Marcus set a wedding date for the following October. She and I spoke regularly, always pleasantly. I watched her. I am a civil engineer by training and by nature, which means I have spent decades looking at how structures bear weight, where they're likely to fail, and what hides behind a clean surface. I watched her the way I watch a bridge. At Marcus's birthday dinner that spring, Vanessa arrived with a birthday card for me, which struck me as unusual since my birthday was 4 months away. She said she'd seen it and thought of me. It was a warm, sentimental card about fathers. I said thank you. Inside, she had written a note about how much it meant to her that I was going to be part of her family, and how she hoped we'd always feel like we could be open with each other. I kept the card. I still have it. It sits in a folder in my desk drawer between Gerald's first letter and a copy of the trust document. The summer before the wedding, Vanessa started asking questions that were less casual and more specific. At a cookout at Marcus's apartment, she asked me what I planned to do with my mother's house, whether I'd thought about selling or holding on to it, whether property management was something I'd considered. She mentioned, as a kind of side note, that a house sitting empty in probate could attract complications. She used the word complications in a way that suggested she knew exactly what she was talking about. I told her Brenda and I were still discussing it, which was true. A month before the wedding, Vanessa called me directly, not Marcus, me, and asked if we could have lunch. Just the two of us. She said she wanted us to feel connected as a family before the big day, and she suggested a restaurant downtown that was nicer than anything in Macon. I went. Of course I went. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Over a 2-hour lunch, she walked me through what she framed as a thoughtful, caring concern. She said she and Marcus had been talking about their future, about starting a family, about the cost of housing in Atlanta. She said she knew it wasn't her place to ask, but she cared about Marcus, and she cared about me. And she just wanted to understand in a general sense what my intentions were regarding my estate planning, whether I'd given any thought to gifting during my lifetime rather than through a will, whether I'd considered the tax advantages of early transfer. She smiled the whole time. She picked up the check without hesitation. She squeezed my hand when we said goodbye. I drove home and sat in my driveway for about 20 minutes. Then I called Gerald and gave him a brief update. He said, "Is there anything you need to change?" I said no. He said, "Good." The wedding was in Savannah in October. It was genuinely beautiful. Marcus wore the same cufflinks I'd worn at my own wedding to Carol, which I'd offered and he'd accepted without making a big thing of it, which is how we do things in this family. I walked around that reception feeling like a man who had managed to hold something precious without breaking it. I danced with my sister Brenda. I gave a toast that made Marcus cry, which he will deny to this day. Vanessa was radiant. She hugged me at the end of the night and told me she was so glad I was her father-in-law. I told her I was glad too. 3 months later, Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning. His voice was different, flat in a specific way that I recognized from when he used to call me during hard things from college when he was struggling, from the months after Carol died. He said he needed to talk to me about something. He said Vanessa had been looking into some things and had some questions. I said, "Does she want to be on the call?" There was a pause. He said yes. She joined, and she was different on that call than she had been in person. Still composed, but the warmth had a different quality to it. Thinner. She said she'd been doing some research into estate planning, just generally, just out of interest, and she'd come across some information about my mother's estate filing through the county probate records. She said she just wanted to understand, as someone who cared about this family's long-term well-being, whether there had been any assets transferred into trust recently, and if so, what the structure looked like. She said she had a contact at a law firm who could help review things, just to make sure everything was set up in the most beneficial way. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt once. And when she was done, I said, very calmly, "Vanessa, I appreciate your interest. My financial affairs are managed by a qualified attorney and are structured exactly as I intend them to be." She pushed back, gently, the way someone pushes on a door to test whether it's locked. She said she wasn't trying to overstep. She just wanted to make sure no one was being taken advantage of, that sometimes older people, especially those grieving, made decisions that weren't in their best interest, and that a second set of eyes could only help. I said, "I understand, and I'm telling you I don't need them." Marcus was quiet the entire time. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand. And I want to tell you honestly what I felt, because it wasn't triumph. It wasn't the satisfaction of a man who'd outmaneuvered someone. It was a deep, slow ache of the kind you feel when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to be exactly what you feared. I wasn't worried about myself. I was worried about my son. Because Marcus was smart. He'd been smart his whole life. But being smart doesn't protect you from loving someone who's using you as a vehicle. That's not an intelligence failure. That's a human one. And I didn't know yet whether Marcus could see it, or whether he was on that call because he believed in what Vanessa was doing. I didn't have to wait long to find out. He called me back alone, 2 hours later, and what he said told me everything I needed to know. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was going to bring that up the way she did." And then, after a pause, "How long has she been looking into this?" I told him about the email, the lunch, the questions that had started before they were even married. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I think I need to have a conversation with her." I said, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." What happened in Marcus and Vanessa's marriage after that point is his story to tell, not mine. I'll only say that over the following 2 months, some things came to light that I was not the only one who hadn't known about. Financial decisions she had made using joint accounts. A credit line opened in Marcus's name. Conversations she'd had with her cousin, the financial advisor, that Marcus found in her email when she left her laptop open. They separated in March. The divorce was final by September. Marcus came and stayed with me for a week in June, right after he moved out of their apartment. We fished every morning. We didn't talk about Vanessa much. We talked about Carol more than we have in years, which is something I hadn't expected. He asked me questions about our marriage that a son usually doesn't ask his father, until the son himself is old enough to need the answers. I told him the truth about all of it, the good and the parts that took work. On the last morning he was there, we were out on the water before the sun came up, and he said, "Did you know? From the beginning?" I thought about that for a minute. The honest answer was, not from the beginning. I had a feeling. I had the kind of alertness that comes when something doesn't add up, but you can't yet name the specific piece that's wrong. What I knew for certain was that my business was my business, and that keeping it private was my right, and that I was glad I had exercised that right before I had reason to regret not doing it. I told him that. I told him the whole story. Gerald, the trust, the lunch in Savannah, the call. I watched his face move through several things in quick succession. Then he nodded. He said, "I'm glad you watched her hands instead of just her face." I didn't know what he meant at first. And then he told me that Ruth, his grandmother, my mother used to say that when he was a boy. Watch people's hands, not their faces. Faces lie. Hands show you what someone's actually doing. I hadn't remembered that. But when he said it, I heard it in her voice, clear as anything. I still think about Ruth a lot. Not just about the money she left, which still doesn't quite feel real even now, but about the life she lived to accumulate it, the discipline of it, the absolute refusal to live beyond what she'd honestly earned. She never told us because she never wanted us to count on something we hadn't built. She wanted us to build. And I think that's what the money actually was, not a gift, exactly, but a lesson delivered in a form we couldn't ignore. I want to say something directly to every father or mother listening to this right now. You do not owe anyone access to your finances. Not your children, not their spouses, not any well-meaning relative who frames the conversation as concern. What is yours is yours. You built it, or it came to you honestly, and you have every right to hold it quietly and make your own choices about it in your own time. That is not secrecy, that is sovereignty. And sometimes it is the most loving thing you can do for the people you care about most, because it removes them from a situation they would not have chosen for themselves. Marcus is doing well now. He bought a small house near mine last winter, which I helped with not because he asked, but because I wanted to, and it was my choice to make. We fish twice a week when the weather holds. He's been seeing someone new, a woman named Patricia, who teaches third grade and brings homemade banana bread when she comes to dinner, and I like her very much. She asked me about my garden the first time we met, and then actually listened to the answer, which is the most reliable test I know. I am 64 years old. I have a trust that's properly set up. I have a son who learned something hard and came out of it intact. I have my mother's house, which Brenda and I decided to keep, and which I've been quietly repairing, room by room, the way Ruth would have wanted. Last month, I finally fixed the back porch, replaced the soft boards, refinished the whole deck, put new railings in. Took me 4 weekends. When I was done, I stood on it in the early morning with a cup of coffee, and I thought about all the years she'd walked around that spot on the floor, not complaining, just adjusting her path. I think about what she knew that she didn't say. I think about the watching, the patience, the long, quiet game of a woman who understood that how you hold something matters just as much as what you hold. That's what she left me. The money was just the part I could count. If you've watched this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if any part of this story sat with you the way it sits with me, share it with someone who might need to hear it. I'll see you in the next one.